The shovel slid into the earth with a sound like a heavy sigh. Elara drove it down with the heel of her boot, the worn leather groaning in protest. She levered the handle back, her shoulders bunching with the strain, and lifted a spadeful of dark, fragrant soil. It was August, and the air in the narrow trench was thick with the smell of damp clay and severed roots. She tossed the dirt onto a growing mound beside the cabin's foundation, the movement practiced, rhythmic, a slow dance she had been performing for 3 weeks. Her hands, calloused and stained, gripped the smooth wood of the shovel's handle. At her feet, lying in the sliver of shade cast by the cabin wall, a great gray dog watched her with eyes the color of a winter sky. His name was Boro, and he did not move, save for the occasional twitch of an ear at the buzz of a horsefly. He was a silent, patient witness to her strange and solitary labor. The trench was now 4 feet deep and just wide enough for her to stand in. It began at the base of the cabin's stone foundation and stretched away for 20 feet, a raw, straight scar across the small clearing. This was only the beginning. From the end of this trench, she would begin to tunnel, digging not down, but straight into the gentle slope of the hill behind her home. She straightened up, arching her back until her spine popped, and wiped a trickle of sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty forearm. The sun was hot on her neck. She looked at the work, then at the dog. Boro blinked slowly, a gesture of profound and settled trust. He did not understand the purpose of the hole, but he understood her. That was enough. A crunch of boots on the gravel path announced a visitor. Elara turned to see Mr. Abernathy, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 70 years of mountain sun and skepticism. He leaned on the top rail of her fence, chewing on a piece of straw. Boro lifted his head but did not rise. "Still at it, I see," Abernathy said. His voice was gravelly, like stones rolling downhill. "Digging a root cellar to China, are you?" Elara picked up her shovel again. "Just a root cellar." "Seems an awful long way from the kitchen door for a root cellar," he observed, spitting the straw to the ground. "And you're going into the hill, not under the house. The ground freezes 4 feet down in a hard winter. Anything you store out here will turn to mush by January. You ought to know that. Your father did." "I have a plan," she said, her voice quiet. She drove the shovel into the earth again, the sound a punctuation mark ending the conversation. Abernathy watched her for another long minute, the silence stretching between them. He shook his head, a small, weary gesture. "That's what your father always said too. Had a plan for everything. Look, girl, I'm just saying, there's a right way to do things, the way folks have always done them. It's worked this long for a reason. All this foolishness." He waved a hand at the trench. "It's just going to wear you out before the first snow, and that's a bad way to start the winter." He didn't wait for a reply. He pushed himself off the fence and continued down the path, his shoulders slumped with the burden of his certainty. Elara kept digging. The sun climbed higher. Boro sighed and rested his great head on his paws. She knew what they said in the small town down in the valley, that the loss of her parents the previous winter had unmoored her, that she was grieving in strange ways, isolating herself, undertaking impossible, pointless tasks. They saw a fragile young woman engaged in a fool's errand. They did not see the worn, leather-bound journal on her nightstand, filled with her father's precise, elegant script. They did not see the pages of temperature charts, geological surveys of their land, and carefully drawn diagrams of airflow and thermal mass. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of gentle concern, carried a casserole dish wrapped in a tea towel. She set it on the porch swing, well away from the flying dirt. "Ilara, dear," she began, her hands fluttering like nervous birds. "You're working so hard. I saw you from my kitchen window. You've been out here since sunup. You have to rest." "I'm fine, Mrs. Gable. Thank you for the food. It's just, what is it you're building? John Abernathy said you're digging a trench to nowhere. He's worried you're going to hurt your back." She lowered her voice. "He said it's not right, a young woman doing this kind of work all alone." "It needs doing," Ilara said simply. Mrs. Gable's eyes were kind, but they were also full of pity, and Ilara found that harder to bear than Abernathy's scorn. "Honey, if you need money, there's work in town. Mr. Thorne is always looking for help at the store. You don't have to punish yourself like this. Your parents wouldn't have wanted that." Ilara stopped digging and looked at the older woman. She leaned on her shovel, her knuckles white. "This isn't a punishment. It's a project. My father's project." The words hung in the air, confirming all of Mrs. Gable's fears. The poor, grieving girl, clinging to her dead father's mad schemes. She patted Ilara's arm awkwardly. "Well, you be careful, and you eat that casserole before it gets cold. My Liam will be by to pick up the dish tomorrow." She left, and Ilara was alone again with Boro and the growing pile of earth. She worked until the sun dipped below the western ridge and the air grew cool. Inside, she lit a single kerosene lamp. The small cabin was sparse, clean, everything in its place. After a simple meal, a portion of Mrs. Gable's casserole, which was rich with cheese and potatoes, she opened the journal. Her father's voice spoke to her from the pages. "The earth breathes, Ilara. It holds the memory of summer's heat deep in its bones, long after the surface has surrendered to frost. A constant, steady temperature, a gift for anyone patient enough to seek it." He had recorded the ground temperature at 10 feet, 20 feet, 50 feet. He had drawn the layers of soil and rock in the hill behind their cabin, 6 feet of topsoil, then a thick layer of dense clay, and below that, shale. "The clay is our friend," he wrote. "It holds the deep warmth. The trick is not to fight the cold, but to borrow the warmth." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. A tunnel, 150 feet long, dug straight into the hill. At its end, it would be nearly 40 feet below the surface. The air at that depth, his charts showed, remained a constant 54 degrees year-round. The tunnel would act as a massive heat exchanger. A pipe would draw cold air from the cabin floor, run it the length of the tunnel where it would be warmed by the surrounding earth, and then a second, higher vent would return the tempered air to the cabin. It wouldn't be hot. It wouldn't replace her wood stove. But it would provide a constant, low-level heat source, a thermal foundation that would dramatically reduce the amount of wood she needed and ensure the cabin never dropped below freezing, even on the coldest nights. It was a bulwark against the kind of deep, relentless cold that had claimed so many lives in the valley's history, the kind of cold that froze pipes, killed livestock, and made a simple power outage a death sentence. Her neighbors saw a girl digging a hole. She was building a lung for her house. She closed the journal and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, she could feel the truth of her father's words. She could feel the steady, patient warmth deep in the earth, waiting. The next day, Liam Gable came for the casserole dish. He was tall and quiet, with his mother's kind eyes but none of her nervous energy. He didn't offer advice or express concern. He just stood by the trench for a moment, watching her work. "That's a lot of digging," he said. "It is," Ilara agreed. "What's it for?" he asked, his curiosity genuine. Ilara hesitated. She was tired of the pity and the scorn, but his tone was different. It was simple, direct. "A heating system," she said. He looked from the trench to the cabin, then back again, his brow furrowed in thought, not judgment. "Geothermal?" Ilara's head snapped up. She stared at him, surprised. He gave a small, self-conscious shrug. "Read a book about it once. Seemed to make sense." He nodded toward the growing pile of dirt. "You're going to need to shore up the walls when you start the tunnel, especially through that clay layer."
"It'll get heavy."
"I have the timbers," she said, gesturing to a neat stack of posts and planks cut from trees on her property. "That's a lot to haul," he said. He looked at her small frame, then at the heavy beams. "My mother sent me for the dish, but I have an hour. I could help you move some of those if you like." For the first time in a long time, the solitude felt less like a shield and more like a burden. She looked at his open, honest face. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements strong and sure. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the sounds of their shared labor. When they were done, the timbers were stacked neatly at the end of the trench, ready for the next phase.
"I have to go,"
he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "But if you need help setting them, well, I'm around." He picked up the empty casserole dish. "I'll tell my mother you liked it." As he walked away, Boro, who had been watching from the porch, got up, stretched, and laid his head on Ilara's knee. She stroked his soft ears, her gaze fixed on the trench. The work was still immense, a mountain of earth to be moved one shovelful at a time. But for the first time, she did not feel entirely alone in it. The earth held its warmth, and the world, it seemed, still held pockets of unexpected kindness. The work became her life, a rhythm measured in inches and feet. The trench was completed, and she began the tunnel itself. The first 10 feet were the hardest. She built a heavy timber frame at the mouth, a square set of thick posts, and a heavy lintel to bear the weight of the earth above. From there, she drove forward into the hill. The process was slow, painstaking. Dig 3 feet, stop. Build another timber frame, slotting the planks in behind it to hold back the walls and ceiling. Haul the dirt out bucket by bucket, using a simple sled she'd fashioned to drag it to the growing pile outside. Boro would often sit at the mouth of the tunnel, a gray sentinel peering into the darkness where she worked by the light of a single battery-powered lantern. Her hands, already calloused, grew raw. They bled, healed, and thickened into leather. Her back was a constant, dull ache. Some days she would emerge at dusk, covered in mud and clay, so tired she could barely wash her face before falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. The town's skepticism continued to find its way to her. When she went to Thorne's general store for supplies, kerosene, flour, salt, he would look at her muddy boots and shake his head. "Heard you're still digging that mine of yours, Ilara," he said one crisp September afternoon, his voice laced with condescending amusement. "Find any gold yet?" The 2 other customers in the store, both ranchers, chuckled. "Just dirt," she replied, counting out her money on the counter. "You know," Thorne leaned forward, his voice taking on a confidential, advisory tone, "for what you're spending on timber and lantern batteries, you could make a down payment on a good propane furnace, or a backup generator. That's the modern way. Reliable." "This will be reliable," she said, gathering her things. "Until the first big rain and that whole tunnel collapses on you," he called after her as she walked out. "You're going to get yourself killed playing in the mud." The days grew shorter. The gold and crimson of the aspen trees on the high ridges faded to a brittle brown. The air grew sharp with the promise of frost. Liam came by twice a week. He never announced his visits. He would simply appear, usually when she was struggling to move a heavy timber or drag a full sled of dirt. He would work alongside her for an hour or two, his quiet presence a steadying force. He asked questions about the design, listening intently as she explained her father's theories about thermal lag and the R value of packed earth. He traced the diagrams in the journal with his finger, his expression one of focused concentration. "He was a smart man, your dad," he said one evening, looking at a page of complex calculations. He saw things differently. "People thought he was strange," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe," Liam said, meeting her eyes in the flickering lamplight. "Or maybe they just weren't looking where he was looking." By mid-October, the tunnel was 70 feet long. She had passed through the topsoil and was deep in the dense, damp clay. It was heavy, sticky work. The air inside was cool and smelled of stone and deep earth. It was a strange, subterranean world, silent save for the scrape of her shovel and her own breathing. She felt a connection to the planet itself, a sense of burrowing into something ancient and alive. The physical toll was immense, but her resolve never wavered. Every bucket of clay hauled out was a victory. Every timber set in place was a line of defense against the coming winter. Mr. Abernathy stopped by again, his face grim. The first hard frost had silvered the valley overnight. "The ground will be freezing soon," he stated, his arms crossed over his chest. "Once that frost gets down a few feet, it'll be like digging through iron. You're running out of time for this game of yours." "I'm almost done," she told him, though she knew 150 feet was still a long way off. "You'd be better off spending your time chopping and stacking wood," he grumbled. "A woodpile is a thing you can trust. You can see it. You can count it. This hole in the ground, it's a prayer to nothing." She did not stop to chop more wood. Her woodshed was already full, stacked tight to the rafters, the result of her father's foresight and her own steady work the previous spring. The tunnel was the priority. It was the system that would make the wood last. One afternoon in early November, she hit shale. The shovel clanged against rock with a jarring thud that vibrated up her arms. For a moment, her heart sank. But the journal had predicted this. The shale is flaky but stable. Work with the grain. Using a pickaxe and a heavy pry bar, she began the slow, arduous process of chipping her way through the rock layer. It was brutal work. Each swing of the pickaxe sent shock waves through her tired body. Progress slowed to a foot a day, then less. Liam came and took turns with her, his strong shoulders making the pickaxe sing. He never complained. He just worked, his jaw set in determination. Together, they broke through the last of the shale layer. She was 140 feet in. The end was in sight. The air that far back was still and cool, but not cold. She held a thermometer in the darkness. It read 54 degrees, exactly as the journal had predicted. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she'd felt in months. Liam saw it, and he smiled back. The final 10 feet were easier, back in the dense clay. On the day she reached the 150-foot mark, a light snow was falling outside, the flakes melting as they touched the ground. The world was gray and quiet. She and Liam worked together to install the pipes. A 4-inch PVC pipe ran along the floor of the tunnel, its mouth positioned to draw air from a register she had cut into the cabin's floorboards. A second, higher pipe would return the air to a vent on the opposite wall. They sealed the end of the tunnel with a thick wall of timber and packed earth. They sealed the joints and connections with painstaking care. When it was finished, they stood in the cabin, the snow falling more heavily now outside the window. Boro lay on the rug, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm. Ilara held her hand over the intake register on the floor. She could feel a faint, almost imperceptible current of cold air being drawn down. She walked to the other side of the room and placed her hand over the output vent. A gentle, steady stream of cool air flowed into the room. It wasn't warm, not yet. The system needed time to stabilize, for the airflow to become a constant, slow-moving river. But it was working. The house was breathing. Liam held a thermometer to the vent. 52 degrees, he said, a note of awe in his voice. The temperature outside was 34 and dropping. It's really working. It'll get stronger, she said. The flow will even out. He looked at her, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes full of a deep and quiet respect. You did it, Ilara. We did it, she corrected him. That night, the first real storm of the season blanketed the valley in 6 inches of snow. Ilara lit a small fire in her wood stove, much smaller than she would have dared the winter before. The cabin was not warm and toasty, but it was comfortable. The chill was gone from the air. The drafts that had always plagued the old floorboards were gone, drawn down into the earth. Boro, who usually curled up as close to the fire as he could get, was sleeping peacefully in the middle of the room. The house felt different. It felt settled, secure. It felt safe. Outside, the snow fell, covering the mound of raw earth, erasing the scars of her long labor under a blanket of pure, silent white. For 2 weeks, the weather held in a pattern of cold stillness. The snow stayed, a permanent feature of the landscape. Life in the valley settled into its winter rhythm. Smoke plumed from chimneys, neighbors waved from their plows, and the talk at Thorne's store was of the price of propane and the depth of the snowpack. Ilara's tunnel was already old news, a summer folly buried and forgotten. She conserved her wood, burning only a few logs in the morning and a few more in the evening. The temperature in the cabin never dropped below 60 degrees. The air from the vent was a constant, silent promise, flowing at a steady 54 degrees, day and night. She would sometimes sit in the quiet of the afternoon and just listen to the soft whisper of air from the vent, the sound of the earth breathing into her home. Liam stopped by often, bringing news from town or just to share a cup of tea in the quiet warmth of her cabin. He remarked on it every time. "You can feel the difference," he'd say, holding his hands out in the middle of the room. "It's not a stuffy heat like a furnace. It's just not cold." Then the forecast began to change. The radio spoke of an Arctic front, a once-in-a-generation weather event pushing down from Canada. They predicted heavy snow, hurricane-force winds, and a catastrophic drop in temperature. People stocked up on supplies, their faces tight with worry. Mr. Abernathy drove his tractor past her cabin, a blade on the front, his expression grim. He didn't stop, but he gave a curt nod, a gesture that acknowledged her presence in their shared, precarious world. Mr. Thorne was doing brisk business selling generators and bags of rock salt. "Better be prepared," he told his customers, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "This is the real thing. This is what separates the prepared from the foolish." The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a deepening silence. The sky turned a bruised metallic gray. The wind died completely. An unnatural stillness fell over the valley, as if the world were holding its breath. Boro paced nervously, whining low in his throat, his eyes fixed on the door. Ilara brought in an extra armload of wood, checked the seals on her windows, and made a large pot of stew. She sat by the window, watching the first flakes of snow begin to fall, thick and heavy as cotton. Within an hour, the world was gone. The snow was no longer falling but flying sideways, driven by a wind that shrieked like a living thing. It was a solid, moving wall of white. The temperature plummeted, 30 degrees, 20, 10, 0. The old cabin groaned under the assault, the timbers popping in the cold, but inside, the air remained calm. The small fire in the stove glowed cheerfully, and the gentle current from the vent continued its silent, tireless work. Around midnight, the lights flickered and died. The hum of the refrigerator ceased. The absolute darkness was broken only by the orange glow of the fire. The power was out. For everyone. A few minutes later, she heard the distant, hopeful chug of a generator starting up at a neighboring farm, followed shortly by another, and then another. The sound was faint, whipped away by the wind, but it was a sign of the valley's tenuous hold on modernity. Ilara added a single log to the fire. Boro lay by the hearth, his head on his paws, finally calm now that the storm was a known quantity. The wind howled, a ceaseless, malevolent scream. Snow piled in deep drifts against the walls, sealing her in. But the cold did not penetrate. The floor was not icy to the touch. The air did not bite at her skin. The cabin was a small, steady island of warmth in an ocean of lethal cold. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Do not fight the cold. Borrow the warmth. She must have dozed off in her chair, because she was startled awake by a sound that did not belong to the storm. A frantic, desperate pounding on her door. Boro was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The wind tore at the sound, but it came again, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled shout. "Ilara! Ilara, please! Open the door!" She recognized the voice. It was Mrs. Gable. Ilara grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and unbarred the door. A blast of wind and snow exploded into the room, sending papers flying and threatening to extinguish the lamp. Two figures, crusted in ice and snow, stumbled inside. It was Mrs. Gable and Liam, their faces pale and stricken. "Our propane tank, the regulator froze solid," Liam managed to say through chattering teeth, helping his mother to a chair by the fire. "The furnace is dead. It's 20 below in the house, dropping fast." Mrs. Gable was trembling violently, her lips blue. We were afraid we were going to freeze." Her eyes darted around the room, wide with disbelief. "But it's warm in here. How is it so warm?" "The power is out." "The tunnel," Ilara said simply, pushing the heavy door shut and barring it against the storm. She handed Mrs. Gable a thick wool blanket. Boro came and nudged the woman's shaking hand with his nose, whining softly. Liam walked to the vent, his hand outstretched. He closed his eyes as he felt the steady, 54-degree air flowing into the room. A look of profound, staggering relief washed over his face. He turned to Ilara, his expression a mixture of awe and gratitude. "It works," he whispered. "My God, Ilara, it actually works." Before an hour had passed, there was another knock. This time it was the Hendersons from down the road with their 2 small children. Their generator had run for an hour before the fuel line gelled in the intense cold. The temperature inside their modern, well-insulated house was already in the 40s. The children were wrapped in blankets, their faces pinched with cold and fear. Ilara welcomed them in without a word, making space for them on the floor near the stove. The cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, was becoming an ark. The little space was crowded now, filled with the quiet, huddled shapes of her neighbors. The sounds of the storm outside seemed more distant, less threatening, buffered by the warmth of shared humanity. The fire in the stove was the heart of their small world, and the silent, steady breath from the earth was its soul. The next to arrive was Mr. Thorne. He came alone, his face hidden by a thick scarf, his usual confident swagger gone, replaced by a humbled, shuffling gait. He had the biggest, most expensive generator in the valley, but it had failed, just like all the others. His large, new house with its vaulted ceilings and picture windows was now a death trap of freezing air. He stood hesitantly in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room full of people.
"My pipes burst," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "The place is a block of ice."
He looked at Alara, his gaze finally settling on the simple vent in the wall. He seemed unable to comprehend it. "How?" was all he could manage. "Come in, Mr. Thorne," Alara said, her voice even. "There's room by the fire." He entered, shedding his snow-covered coat, and found a small space on the floor. He sat with his back against the wall, staring at the small stove as if it were a miracle. He did not speak again. The last to arrive was John Abernathy. He appeared in the pre-dawn hours, a ghost-like figure crusted in snow. His firewood, he explained in a low growl, was buried under a 10-foot drift, and the blizzard force winds had created a downdraft that had filled his cabin with smoke, forcing him to extinguish his fire. He, the most experienced, most self-sufficient man in the valley, had been defeated. His pride was a visible wound. He stood, his old back stiff, and surveyed the scene. The crowded cabin, the sleeping children, the steady, quiet warmth. He walked over to Liam, who was tending the small fire. "Let me see it," he commanded, his voice rough. Liam nodded toward the vent. Abernathy knelt down, his old knees cracking in protest. He held his gnarled, work-worn hand in the stream of air. He held it there for a long time, his eyes closed, as if reading a language only he could understand. He felt the temperature, the consistency, the undeniable fact of it. He stood up slowly. He turned and looked across the crowded room at Alara. Their eyes met. The scorn, the pity, the dismissiveness he had always shown her were gone, replaced by a look of stark, humbling clarity. He cleared his throat. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "It works," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. He looked around at the other faces, at Thorne, at the Gables, at all of them. "The girl's foolishness. It works." He found a spot on the floor, took a mug of hot tea from Alara's hand, and wrapped his fingers around it. No other words were needed. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the very people who had doubted her, Alara's quiet, stubborn labor had been vindicated not by argument, but by the simple, irrefutable fact of warmth. Her home was no longer just a cabin, it was a sanctuary. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. Alara's small cabin, designed for 1, became a shelter for 15. They shared food, blankets, and stories, their voices low in the dim light. The social structures of the valley dissolved in the face of shared need. Mr. Thorne, the wealthy store owner, helped Liam chop kindling from a broken chair. Mrs. Gable hummed lullabies to the Henderson children. Mr. Abernathy, using his vast knowledge of the old ways, showed them how to melt snow for drinking water on the stovetop without wasting precious heat. They were a single huddled tribe, kept alive by a hole in the ground and the quiet resolve of the young woman they had all dismissed. Alara moved among them, a calm center in the small storm of humanity. She refilled mugs, checked on the sleeping children, and ensured the fire never burned too high or too low. She spoke little, but her presence was a constant reassurance. They watched her, no longer with pity or skepticism, but with a kind of reverence. They saw not a grieving, eccentric girl, but a provider, a leader whose wisdom ran deeper than their own. When the wind finally died and the snow stopped, a profound silence descended. The world outside was an alien landscape, buried under a sea of white, sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind. It was beautiful and terrible. Liam and Abernathy managed to clear the door, digging a tunnel out into the new world. The sun was brilliant on the snow, the air so cold and clean it hurt to breathe. One by one, the families prepared to leave, to return to their frozen homes and assess the damage. As Mrs. Gable was leaving, she paused and took Elara's hands in her own. Her eyes were full of tears. "You saved us, dear," she said. "You saved all of us." Mr. Thorne was the last to depart, after Abernathy. He stopped in the doorway, turning his hat over and over in his hands. He looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I was wrong. What I said. I was a fool. A pompous fool." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a humility she had never seen in him. "Thank you." Elara just nodded. The apology was accepted. The following spring, after the great melt, a change came over the valley. The story of Elara's folly, now retold as Elara's way, had become local legend. The blizzard of that year became the benchmark by which all other winters were measured, and survival had created a new kind of respect. Men who had once chuckled at her efforts now appeared at her fence, hats in hand, asking if she might have a look at their land to see if it was suitable. Liam, who had become a constant and welcome presence in her life, helped her transfer her father's elegant but esoteric notes into practical, easy-to-follow diagrams. They spent long evenings at her kitchen table, poring over the journal, turning theory into instruction. Abernathy came by and offered his expertise on timbering and reading the signs of the earth, his old wisdom merging with her father's new science. Even Mr. Thorne contributed, using his supply connections to order long lengths of PVC pipe at cost for anyone who wanted to build. That summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of digging. 5 more tunnels were started. Elara did not supervise, but she consulted, answering questions with her characteristic quiet certainty. She would walk to a site with Boro at her heels, feel the soil, study the slope of the land and say, "Start here, go this way." And they would. Her word had become gospel. Years passed. The tunnels became a standard feature in the valley, as common as a well or a woodpile. They were a source of quiet pride, a symbol of the community's resilience and ingenuity. The houses were safer, the winters less menacing. The knowledge, once the secret of a single journal, was now shared, common property. Elara married Liam. They built a small addition onto the cabin for their children, and its foundation was warmed by the same gentle breath from the earth. Boro grew old. His gray muzzle turned white, his movements became slow and deliberate. He spent most of his days sleeping in his favorite spot, where the warm air from the vent washed over him. One autumn morning, when the leaves were at their peak of color, he did not wake up. Elara found him lying peacefully, as if in a deep sleep. She and Liam buried him on the hill behind the cabin, beneath a tall pine tree that overlooked the home he had guarded so faithfully. She stood by the simple stone marker for a long time, her hand resting on the cool stone, a silent farewell to her first and most loyal believer. Elara herself grew old. Her dark hair turned the color of winter snow. Her hands, forever marked by the labor of that first summer, became wrinkled, but they remained strong. She became the valley's quiet matriarch, the keeper of its most important wisdom. Young couples, building their first homes, would come to sit with her on her porch, and she would tell them about the earth, about patience, and about how the most profound strength often comes from the most gentle, persistent forces. She never spoke of her vindication, only of the work itself and of the simple, elegant truth her father had discovered. She died peacefully in her sleep, in the same bed, in the same warm cabin, on a cold winter's night decades after the great blizzard. The entire valley turned out for her funeral. They buried her on the hill next to Boro, under the tall pine. Liam, old himself but still straight and tall, carved her headstone from a piece of local granite. It did not list her accomplishments or her titles. It said only, "Ilara. She showed us the way." Long after she was gone, the cabin remained. It stood as a monument, not of stone or steel, but of wood and earth and quiet intelligence. Children who had only heard the stories would come and look at it, trying to imagine the young, solitary woman who had dug a hole to nowhere. And every winter, when the snows fell deep and the winds howled down from the high peaks, a thin, steady wisp of smoke would rise from its chimney. Inside, the air, drawn from the deep, unwavering heart of the earth, would continue its silent, ceaseless flow, a warm breath in a cold world, a lasting testament to the woman who had listened to the ground beneath her feet.